Every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today I bring you a delightful new mystery, featuring the ever-observant and wonderfully sharp Miss Marple, the beloved amateur sleuth, created by Agatha Christie. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel this charming puzzle together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment, and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Let's get started. Miss Marple and the stranger at the sewing circle. It had been some years since Miss Marple last attended Mrs. Bantry's sewing circle. Indeed, the group itself had quietly faded away, as such things often do, dissolving into a haze of genteel excuses and unspoken tensions. So when the delicate card arrived, ivory with a crisp embossed edge, inviting her to a revived gathering, Miss Marple was mildly surprised. She could not help but wonder what had prompted the resurrection of this particular circle. Village life had taught her that social events in St. Mary Mead were never entirely innocent. The simple act of sewing, pleasant though it might be, was rarely the real reason for such gatherings. As she placed the card beside her teapot, Miss Marple found her thoughts drifting backward. There had once been whispers, little ripples of scandal, that clung stubbornly to the sewing circle's name. Something about an argument or perhaps a disappearance, though time had blurred the details. Gossip, she reminded herself, was like old lace, delicate, intricate, and more revealing when held to the light. And so, curiosity piqued, Miss Marple found herself accepting the invitation, with the sense that the past was not quite finished with Mrs. Bantry's sewing circle. The gathering was held in Mrs. Bantry's sunroom, its tall windows spilling weak afternoon light across a table cluttered with embroidery hoops, biscuit tins, and teapots. The faces around the table were comfortably familiar, except for one, Mrs. Fanshawe. She was introduced with a faint note of pride, as though her presence lent the group an air of modern sophistication. Newly arrived in the village, Mrs. Fanshawe had taken the little ivy-covered cottage at the edge of the green. There was something oddly purposeful in the way Mrs. Fanshawe listened, a sort of watchful politeness, her smile never quite reaching her eyes, and her questions. Oh, her questions. Had anyone lived in that cottage before? Were any of the original sewing circle ladies still here? Did people still talk about what happened all those years ago? It was, Miss Marple noted, a curious line of inquiry for someone freshly arrived. As fingers stitched and cups were refilled, conversation meandered as village gossip often does, touching lightly on gardens, grandchildren, and the state of the vicar's roof. But, as though drawn to it by some invisible thread, the talk eventually circled back to the past. "There was that dreadful business," began Mrs. Bantry, before her voice trailed off into a conveniently vague silence. "Oh, but that was ever so long ago," said Mrs. Pettigrew with a brittle laugh, her hands working her needlepoint a fraction too fast. Miss Marple said nothing, merely observing the small flickers of discomfort that passed between the older members. "A tragedy, yes. But what sort of tragedy, exactly?" Mrs. Fanshawe, her needle momentarily still, leaned in just slightly, the way someone might lean toward a keyhole, listening for secrets best left undisturbed. While the others dismissed Mrs. Fanshawe as a harmless oddity, Miss Marple had lived far too long in villages to believe in coincidences. There was a pattern to Mrs. Fanshawe's interest, a pattern that traced back to certain names and certain incidents, always from that same troublesome year. It was the precision of her curiosity that unsettled Miss Marple, the way her questions skipped over polite subjects and went straight to old scandals and half-forgotten names. This was no idle village newcomer making small talk. Mrs. Fanshawe was searching. But for what? Or whom? Miss Marple folded her hands quietly in her lap, her needlework forgotten. One learned, after all, to recognize the pattern of secrets being tugged loose, and Mrs. Fanshawe was tugging with particular determination. As the sewing circle dispersed, hats were adjusted, and goodbyes exchanged in the comfortably over-polite tone of English village life. But just as Miss Marple stepped into the hallway to collect her coat, she caught the low murmur of a private conversation between two older members lingering by the door. "She shouldn't have come back," one whispered. "It's too late now," said the other, her voice tight with fear. "We should have told her. Long ago." They both glanced toward the sunroom, where Mrs. Fanshawe stood alone, examining a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. A photograph taken, as it happened, on the steps of the very first sewing circle meeting. Miss Marple slipped out quietly into the dusk, her mind already weaving a far more intricate pattern than any of the embroideries inside Mrs. Bantry's sunroom. Some secrets, she reflected, were like stains in old linen. No matter how many times they were washed and pressed, they always found a way to seep through. The afternoon was quiet, the kind of peace that only St. Mary Mead could offer. The sunlight fell gently through the open windows, casting delicate shadows on the table where the sewing circle had gathered. Conversation flowed with the ease of old friends. Pleasant, harmless chatter about gardens and the best way to prune roses. But then, as if dropped casually into the calm, came Mrs. Fanshawe's voice. "Do you know, I've heard the Arkwright family lived here some years ago. I wonder what happened to them." Her tone was light, almost too light, as though the question had no weight at all. But Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. There was a precision in the question, an undercurrent that hinted at something more. It was the sort of inquiry you might expect from someone who had done their homework, who was looking for more than idle gossip. As Mrs. Fanshawe turned her attention back to her needlework, Miss Marple couldn't help but notice the subtle way she had phrased it, as if she had already known the family's history, and was simply testing to see who would bite. Miss Marple said nothing, of course. She rarely did in these moments, but her mind began to weave the first threads of a mystery. The conversation continued, polite and meandering, until Mrs. Fanshawe dropped another remark, this time with a little more weight to it. "I wonder, too, about that poor girl from the 1930s. The one who disappeared, remember? I believe she was connected to the circle, wasn't she?" The effect was immediate. Mrs. Pettigrew, who had been knitting quietly, dropped her needle. It clattered on the floor, the noise too sharp for such a soft conversation. Mrs. Bantry's hand fluttered to her throat, and her face, once composed, now flickered with an expression Miss Marple knew all too well. Unease. Yes, of course," Mrs. Bantry said quickly, her voice unnaturally bright. "But as you say, that was years ago. A dreadful business, really. Better not to dwell on it." Miss Marple's eyes rested on Mrs. Fanshawe for a moment longer than was polite. The air in the room had shifted. It was no longer the pleasant buzz of afternoon gossip. Something had stirred, and Miss Marple knew, instinctively, that it wasn't just idle curiosity that had led Mrs. Fanshawe to mention the missing girl. The rest of the meeting passed with a strange awkwardness. Women returned to their stitching, their fingers moving more briskly than before, and yet their minds were elsewhere. Miss Marple could see it in their faces, the stiff shoulders, the unspoken tension in the way their hands trembled just slightly as they worked. There were no more easy smiles, no more soft laughter. The conversation had faltered, each woman looking for a way to re-anchor it to safer ground. Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward as she observed. There was something in the avoidance of Mrs. Fanshaw's question, something in the way they danced around the subject. It wasn't just a matter of being polite. No, it was deeper than that. She watched as Mrs. Pettigrew's eyes darted nervously towards Mrs. Bantry, and saw the barely perceptible shake of Mrs. Bantry's head, a warning, perhaps, or a plea. The others fell quiet, and the thread of conversation was cut. One of the older women coughed, as if to clear the air, but Miss Marple knew better. They were not just avoiding the memory of the missing girl. They were hiding something. As the circle slowly disbanded, the usual murmurs of goodbye and thank you for a lovely afternoon echoed through the hall. But just as Miss Marple reached for her shawl, she paused. Two women, once close friends, remained at the door, speaking in hushed tones, unaware that their conversation drifted into the hallway. "I've told you before, we can't go on like this," one of them said, her voice tight. "You know it's too late for that now," the other replied, low and urgent. "We can't bring it up again. Not now. Not after all this time." Miss Marple's steps faltered. Her hand, already on the door handle, paused. She wasn't meant to overhear this, of course. But in that split moment she caught the words, heavy with the weight of old secrets. She continued walking as though she had heard nothing, but the unease settled deep in her chest. There was a veiled threat in their words, a subtle warning someone in that room was still hiding the truth, and they would do anything to keep it buried. As Miss Marple made her way home through the narrow lanes of St. Mary Mead, her mind sifted through the fragments of the afternoon. The missing girl, the sudden defensiveness in the room, Mrs. Fanshaw's two curious questions. It was all beginning to fall into place, but the pieces felt strange, mismatched. She had the sensation of holding a tapestry, one where a few threads had been pulled loose, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't quite stitch them back together. She paused at the end of the lane, looking back at the village green. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. There was something deeply unnerving about the way Mrs. Fanshawe had approached the subject. Something Miss Marple couldn't quite put her finger on. And then, as if a light had flickered on in the dark, the thought came to her. This was no innocent inquiry. Mrs. Fanshawe had come here with a purpose. To uncover a truth, yes. But for what reason? To expose it, or to use it to her advantage? That evening, as she sat by the fire, Miss Marple opened her notebook, a habit she had long kept, scribbling her thoughts and observations as the night wore on. She rarely wrote in detail, preferring instead to leave her reflections in brief, often cryptic notes to herself. Her pen scratched across the page, the words forming more clearly with each line. "They all know something. But what?" she wrote, her hand pausing for a moment, as if even she wasn't sure of what that something might be. She closed the notebook, her thoughts swirling like the smoke from the fire. Mrs. Fanshawe wasn't just an outsider. She was a key to something much deeper. And the question was, what would she do with the knowledge once it was uncovered? Miss Marple sat back in her chair, staring into the fire. The evening was drawing to a close, but the mystery was only just beginning. There was an unmistakable quiet in the air when the sewing circle met again. Voices did not float as cheerfully as before, and conversations seemed to halt whenever Mrs. Fanshawe entered the room. She offered a polite greeting, her gaze settling on each member in turn, yet few returned more than a brief nod. Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Pettigrew kept smoothing her skirt with restless fingers, how Mrs. Bantry's voice had lost its usual warmth. Even Mrs. Fanshawe, who had shown such lively curiosity at the previous gathering, seemed careful in her questions, as though measuring each word. When a gentle inquiry arose about the best thread to use for monogramming, only half the group responded. The others exchanged uneasy glances. The conversation drifted to safe topics, recipes, flowers, but never lingered, as if everyone wished to avoid any hint of deeper matters. Miss Marple sensed that something remained unsettled, like a piece of unfinished stitching hidden away in a drawer. These women had gathered to sew, yet a tangible awareness of recent tensions stitched them together in a far more intricate pattern. Partway through the meeting, Mrs. Bantry rose to pour tea, while Mrs. Fanshawe quietly passed around a plate of freshly baked lemon biscuits. They were a cheerful shade, their sweet citrus scent filling the room. Several of the women took one politely, including Mrs. Hargreaves, who nibbled at the edge before dipping hers into her tea. Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Fanshawe's gaze flickered toward Mrs. Hargreaves. There was no overt malice, no hint of wrongdoing, yet the moment left Miss Marple feeling curiously unsettled. She sipped her tea and watched. Only a few minutes later, Mrs. Hargreaves let out a sharp gasp. Her teacup rattled on its saucer. She tried to speak, but her words twisted into a strangled cough. Her hand gripped the edge of the table, and in a single terrifying moment, she collapsed. The circle erupted in alarm. Voices rose in sudden panic. Someone shouted Mrs. Hargreaves's name. Another rushed to support her, but her head slumped forward as her breathing grew labored. Mrs. Pettigrew stood, trembling, while Mrs. Bantry hurried to find help. Miss Marple, feeling a familiar chill, bent closer. Whatever had just happened was no minor feint. Mrs. Hargreaves's face took on a pallor that spoke of something far more grave. By the time help arrived, she had already ceased to move, leaving behind an eerie stillness that stole across the sewing circle like a shroud. When the initial shock had subsided into hushed disbelief, murmurs began to ripple through the group. They glanced at the untouched biscuits, then at Mrs. Fanshawe, who stood off to one side with an unsettled expression. Nobody voiced an accusation outright, but the suggestion was apparent in every whispered exchange. Mrs. Fanshawe, after all, had prepared the lemon biscuits. Only she knew their recipe. Only she had handled them. A few women began to edge away from her, as though proximity might bring some dreadful consequence. Mrs. Fanshawe opened her mouth to speak, but seemed at a loss for words. Her composure faltered, and she reached for her handbag, as if searching for a handkerchief, to steady her trembling hands. Miss Marple watched carefully, noting the fleeting moments of panic and confusion passing over Mrs. Fanshawe's face. In that charged atmosphere, it was all too easy to assume the newcomer had brought death along with her biscuits. Yet Miss Marple's instinct whispered that the truth was seldom so simple. She observed the others as they gathered in hushed clusters, their eyes flicking from the plate of biscuits to Mrs. Fanshawe. Amid the flurry of speculation, Miss Marple detected something that sent a subtle chill through her thoughts. One of the older members, generally timid and soft-spoken, allowed the faintest curve of relief to cross her lips, as though a heavy burden had suddenly lifted. It happened quickly, hardly noticeable, unless one had spent a lifetime reading the smallest shifts in human behavior. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, her own expression kindly neutral. She had no wish to startle or confront. People often revealed themselves when they believed no one was watching. And in that brief instant, it seemed to her that the death of Mrs. Hargreaves was, for at least one woman in the room, a preferable outcome. Why? She filed the question away in the quiet recesses of her mind, even as Mrs. Bantry approached, clearly shaken. "It's dreadful, Jane," whispered Mrs. Bantry, grasping Miss Marple's hand for comfort. One moment she was perfectly fine, and then Miss Marple nodded gently, offering a few reassuring words. All the while she kept her thoughts focused on the peculiar mix of emotions swirling around this tragic event: fear, shock, grief, and a subtle trace of satisfaction. By the time the authorities arrived, rumor had already spread that poison was the likely cause. The possibility loomed among them like a grim spectre. Miss Marple stood quietly, letting the voices of the circle drift around her, each speculation more dramatic than the last. She could not help but remember certain tidbits of gossip from years gone by. Mrs. Hargreaves had once featured in a scandalous tale involving a dashed engagement and whispered allegations. At the time, it had seemed like fleeting village chatter, but in retrospect, it carried the residue of unresolved tension. Mrs. Fanshawe, looking pale and guarded, tried to explain her recipe for the biscuits to a concerned inspector, claiming she had done nothing out of the ordinary. Others cast sidelong glances at her, as though unconvinced. Miss Marple offered no direct defense. She rarely rushed to exonerate or condemn. Instead, she watched the interplay of guilt, confusion, and worry in every face. If poison was indeed used, Miss Marple reasoned, it might have had little to do with the newcomer's baking. Old resentments had a habit of remaining potent long after they were first conceived, sometimes flaring up when least expected. When the gathering finally broke up, Miss Marple lingered, her mind still sifting through the aftermath. She approached Mrs. Bantry, who stood alone, folding a handkerchief over and over in nervous loops. "This isn't as straightforward as it seems," Miss Marple said quietly. "I'm afraid the past may have more to do with this than we'd like to think." Mrs. Bantry gave a tremulous nod. "We all hoped it was behind us," she whispered, "but it appears not." Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on her arm. "We must be cautious," she said, her voice gentle yet resolute. "And we must be sure of the facts before we leap to conclusions." With that, she left Mrs. Bantry to her thoughts. In the fading light, Miss Marple could almost sense the undercurrent of old secrets stirring. One life had ended, but the mystery surrounding it was only just beginning. Miss Marple decided that a friendly call on the vicar's wife would be both sociable and illuminating. She knew well that the vicarage often served as a discreet repository of old parish tales, the sort that never quite made the official records yet lingered in hushed recollections. On her arrival, the vicar's wife welcomed her warmly, offering tea with a smile that hinted at more than mere hospitality. They settled into a gentle conversation about the village, touching on improvements to the church hall and the usual concerns about committee budgets. Yet Miss Marple noted how her hostess watched her closely, perhaps sensing she had come for more than chit-chat. It was then that Miss Marple, with her customary grace, began to guide the talk toward the past, particularly any curious incidents that might shed light on recent tragedies. The vicar's wife, after a slight hesitation, admitted she had indeed come across certain stories involving the sewing circle. She seemed relieved to share them, as though releasing a burden. Miss Marple listened intently, taking mental note of every detail. Whether gossip or fact, the vicarage knew things the rest of the village had long since chosen to forget. Over their second cup of tea, the vicar's wife lowered her voice to recount a scandal that had unsettled the village some 30 years before. It all began, she said, with an ill-tempered quarrel at one of the sewing circle meetings, a dispute so fierce it sent ripples through the usually decorous community. A young woman named Margaret Arkwright had been at the heart of it. No one spoke freely of her now, yet the vicar's wife recalled how whispers had swirled around her sudden disappearance. Some claimed she'd run away, others hinted at something more sinister. The oddest thing was that Margaret had apparently left no message, nor any trace of where she might have gone. There were many rumors, the vicar's wife confided, her tone turning somber. But nothing ever came of them. People believed she might have eloped or simply fled. All we truly know is that she was never seen again. Miss Marple observed the tremor in the vicar's wife's hand, revealing how such a distant event could still carry a lingering sense of unease. The name Margaret Arkwright now seemed more than a whisper from the past. It loomed as a central piece in the puzzle of recent events, one that Miss Marple intended to fit into its proper place. Curiosity led Miss Marple to inquire whether there had ever been an Arkwright sister, someone who left the village shortly after Margaret vanished. The vicar's wife nodded, recalling that Margaret did indeed have a younger sibling, though details were scarce. A hush had fallen over the family name following Margaret's disappearance, as though shame and sorrow had driven them into seclusion. Encouraged by Miss Marple's gentle questioning, the vicar's wife checked a small ledger of parish entries, confirming what she had suspected. The younger Arkwright girl had left the village with relatives soon after the scandal. The entry provided a surname the vicar's wife barely recognized. Yet when she spoke it aloud, Miss Marple felt a quiet surge of satisfaction. It matched the name Mrs. Fanshawe had used before her marriage. So Mrs. Fanshawe was not just a curious newcomer, eager to dig up old stories. She was, in fact, Margaret Arkwright's sister, returned to St. Mary Mead under a different name. Miss Marple thanked the vicar's wife for her help, her mind racing. The significance was unmistakable. Mrs. Fanshawe's questions were not idle. She had come back with a motive, one connected deeply to Margaret's unsolved fate. As Miss Marple walked away from the vicarage, her thoughts turned to Mrs. Hargreaves's sudden death at the sewing circle. Until now, suspicion had settled on Mrs. Fanshawe for bringing the ill-fated biscuits. But if the real target had been Mrs. Fanshawe herself, Margaret's sister, then everything changed. It struck Miss Marple that Mrs. Hargreaves might have been the unwitting victim of a scheme meant for someone else. Perhaps the biscuit was never intended for her at all. Mrs. Fanshawe, after all, had stirred up old anxieties with her pointed questions. If she was closing in on the truth of Margaret's disappearance, it was not unthinkable that someone felt the need to silence her. Yet circumstances had led Mrs. Hargreaves to partake of the very treat meant to eliminate a threat to old secrets. Miss Marple pursed her lips, recalling the fleeting look of relief on another woman's face. If the plan had gone awry, then the true conspirator might be growing more desperate by the day. By the time Miss Marple neared her cottage, the afternoon light had taken on a softer hue. She found her thoughts drifting back to Margaret Arkwright. What had she discovered all those years ago? What hidden truth had compelled her to vanish, or be made to vanish? Mrs. Fanshawe's determined return now made perfect sense. She was not seeking idle gossip. She was searching for whatever her sister had left behind. A secret significant enough to lure her back to a village she had once fled in disgrace. Miss Marple paused at her front gate, considering the weight of these unanswered questions. Someone in St. Mary Mead had harbored guilt or fear for 3 decades, and if they were willing to commit murder now, it spoke of secrets as potent today as when Margaret disappeared. Quietly, Miss Marple resolved to dig deeper. She had come too far in her observations to let the matter rest. After all, the truth about Margaret's fate might shed light on the very poison that now threatened more than one life in the village. Miss Marple set about her inquiries in the quiet way she knew best. Armed with tidbits from village gossip, an assortment of notes gleaned from the vicar's records, and her own recollections of whispered tales, she began to reconstruct the names and faces of the original sewing circle from the 1930s. It was a puzzle that required both patience and intuition. Some members had long since left St. Mary Mead, while others remained under different surnames, having married or remarried. Still patterns emerged as she cross-referenced births, marriages, and gatherings held in the old church hall. That slender thread led her from one name to the next, each revealing a small corner of a larger tapestry. She noticed how often Margaret Arkwright's name appeared in relation to certain families. A mention in a parish announcement here, a scrawled note in the vicar's ledger there. The faint echoes of her presence suggested she had once been at the heart of the circle. And given her tragic disappearance, Miss Marple reasoned that the chain of events might have bound many lives together in guilt or sorrow, or both. Tracing Margaret's connections, Miss Marple uncovered a startling thread involving two women who had once been close friends. Both claimed the affection of the same man, Margaret's fiancé, a charismatic fellow whose heart, by all accounts, wavered between devotion and temptation. In those days, a broken engagement was not something taken lightly, especially not in a respectable village like St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple took care to ask her questions indirectly. At the post office, she inquired about the old families. At the grocery, she hinted about wedding announcements from decades past. A pattern of quiet confessions emerged, nodding heads, lowered voices, and a sense that people still harbored strong feelings. One woman, it seemed, had lured Margaret's fiancé away with promises of stability and social standing, while the other had grown bitter, resentful of Margaret's supposed hold over him. The rivalry rippled through the sewing circle like a tear in delicate fabric, and somewhere in the midst of it all, Margaret herself had tried to maintain her dignity. Miss Marple wondered if the fiancé's shifting loyalties had sown the seeds of deeper discord. Sometimes, she reminded herself, a hurtful betrayal can be overshadowed only by an even darker deed yet to come. As Miss Marple delved further, she stumbled upon a series of curious remarks that pointed to something more than romantic rivalry. A few villagers hinted that Margaret had uncovered a scandalous secret about one of the sewing circle members, a secret that could ruin reputations if it ever came to light. Discreetly, Miss Marple coaxed details from an elderly neighbor who recalled hushed conversations about a debt of shame and a letter that should never have existed. Although her informant spoke in fragments, the suggestion was clear. Margaret wielded knowledge potent enough to give her leverage over someone of influence. Such a situation, Miss Marple reflected, could have turned lethal if desperation took hold. Pride, social standing, and fear of exposure formed a potent mix, one that might drive an otherwise respectable individual to commit the unthinkable. How easy it would be, Miss Marple thought, to disguise a crime of blackmail as a tragic accident or a sudden disappearance, especially if the rest of the circle agreed to remain silent. The notion left her unsettled, yet a glimmer of understanding began to form. Margaret's power to blackmail might have been the first step on a path that led straight to her vanishing, and possibly more secrets long overshadowed by time. Piecing together snippets of old rumors, Miss Marple discovered a particularly damning clue that brought Margaret's story into sharper focus. Margaret had been with child. In those days, an unmarried pregnancy was enough to provoke scandal, especially if it involved someone already betrothed, or worse, someone promised to another. This revelation cast Margaret not only as a romantic rival, but also as a source of profound disgrace. Such a situation would have stoked the fires of jealousy and fear among those whose reputations hung precariously in the balance. The sewing circle, with its facade of polite needlework, might have concealed deeper tensions than anyone guessed. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to reflect on the emotional turmoil that must have erupted in those final days before Margaret's disappearance. Bitter accusations, covert threats, and frantic attempts to avoid a public scandal. Any of these could have led to violence, And if multiple members knew the truth, they would have a collective reason to keep it buried, regardless of the cost. The more Miss Marple learned, the more she understood how a single, unforgivable secret could twist friendships into hostilities and overshadow even the most genteel of gatherings. The legacy of those events had not faded with time. Mrs. Fanshaw's return, along with her pointed questions about Margaret, tore open the old wounds once more. The remaining members of that original circle, now older, though no less protective, found themselves reeling under the sudden spotlight of unwanted attention. Miss Marple heard the tremor in their voices whenever the topic arose. Some reacted with a cool refusal to discuss ancient history, while others seemed on the verge of confiding, but then retreated, as though realizing the danger of letting the truth slip. What had begun as a personal quest for Mrs. Fanshawe turned into a reckoning for everyone who had a part in the old scandal. Miss Marple sensed their mounting fear, the fear that the full tale might be exposed. And if, in desperation, someone had turned to murder once more, it hinted that the circle's darkest chapter was far from over. As the shadows of suspicion grew, Miss Marple quietly wondered if the recent poisoning at the sewing circle was, in fact, a continuation of what began all those years ago. Perhaps it was not meant merely to silence gossip about the present, but to keep hidden the truth about Margaret and her unborn child. If so, the real motive might lie in the minds of those who bore the deepest guilt, a guilt that had lingered for decades. Miss Marple recalled the startled looks, the trembling hands, and the faint sigh of relief she had witnessed on one face, a face that might have dreaded Margaret's story coming to light more than anything else. With each fresh piece of insight, the puzzle grew clearer. Yet Miss Marple sensed there were still missing fragments, threads that had yet to be woven together. One thing, however, was certain. The past was not as buried as some had hoped, and the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead were now haunted by more than just whispered secrets. News spread swiftly through St. Mary Mead that Mrs. Pettigrew had been found floating in her own garden pond, a sight so jarring that even the most stoic villagers were left unsettled. The discovery was made early in the morning by a neighbor who noticed something pale amidst the lily pads. When the authorities arrived, they found Mrs. Pettigrew clutching a piece of tattered lace in one rigid hand. The shock rippled through the sewing circle, already shaken by the recent tragedy. Tongues wagged in whispers at the post office, the grocer's, and along the high street. Few could reconcile the image of Mrs. Pettigrew, a gentle soul who had always seemed rather anxious, yet harmless, with the grim spectacle in her pond. Some wondered if the lace held significance, or if it was merely something she had chanced upon in her final moments. To Miss Marple, however, it seemed far too deliberate to be dismissed as coincidence. She recalled the hush that had fallen over the group whenever old tales were hinted at, the odd remarks exchanged in secretive tones. Now here lay a woman who might have held answers to those very tales, only to be silenced in the most unsettling manner. Standing at her window, Miss Marple let her mind dwell on the somber reality. Another member of the circle was gone, leaving behind more questions than answers, and a growing sense that something terrible was festering beneath the village's polite veneer. Hardly had the shock of Mrs. Pettigrew's death registered when rumors sprouted like weeds after the rain. Quietly, people began suggesting that she had taken her own life, perhaps under the weight of guilt linked to recent revelations. Some pointed accusingly at Mrs. Fanshaw's insistent questions, muttering that the newcomer had stirred up old secrets too painful to bear. "She looked so troubled these past days," said one voice at the bakery. "It's no wonder she might have done something rash." Others insisted that Mrs. Pettigrew had shown signs of distress long before the circle reconvened. Empty stares, restless hands, an inability to finish her needlework. If there was guilt inside her, they surmised, perhaps it had become too much. Miss Marple listened politely to these theories, yet her intuition resisted. She recalled how often a convenient explanation had shielded deeper truths. A pond might hide more than just a woman's despair. Still, the village chatter insisted on painting Mrs. Pettigrew as a frail spirit, undone by her own remorse. It was a narrative easily believed, but too easily, in Miss Marple's estimation. For while it might suit those who wished to bury the past again, it did little to address the peculiar details of Mrs. Pettigrew's final moments. When Miss Marple was allowed a discreet glance at the scene, thanks to her unassuming rapport with the local constable, she observed a distinct set of muddy footprints leading away from the pond's edge. Such footprints, in her estimation, were far too orderly to belong to someone in the throes of a desperate suicide. They spoke instead of a second presence, one who had no desire to linger. She stood at a careful distance, avoiding undue interference. Yet her gaze traveled steadily along the bank, noting the pattern where the grass had been flattened underfoot. It was as though someone had approached the pond under cover of darkness, leaving only the faintest trail of evidence behind. If Mrs. Pettigrew had truly taken her own life, Miss Marple murmured under her breath, why would another set of footprints be heading off so purposefully? The constable, busy with his notes, seemed fixated on the official line of inquiry, but Miss Marple's mind worked differently. She considered the possibility that Mrs. Pettigrew had been met there, perhaps confronted or even pushed into the water, and that her final act of clutching lace was a wordless cry for help or justice. If so, the suicide theory was nothing more than a convenient veil, allowing the real culprit to slip away unnoticed. When Miss Marple learned that Mrs. Pettigrew had been found gripping a piece of old lace, her memory flickered. She recalled a dress from decades earlier, worn proudly at a sewing circle gathering not long before Margaret Arkwright vanished. The lace in question had been distinctive, crafted with a pattern that only a keen eye would remember. The notion that Mrs. Pettigrew should be clutching such a fragment at her death was too pointed to ignore. Could it have been torn during a struggle? Or had Mrs. Pettigrew seized upon it in a last effort to signal her killer's identity? Miss Marple suspected it was far from random. She let her mind wander back to the old stories of Margaret, her fiancé, the rumors of blackmail, the hush of scandal. A length of lace might once have served as a prized adornment, or it might have been part of a clandestine clue. Now it emerged again in a most unsettling context. If the lace linked Mrs. Pettigrew's final moments to a distant tragedy, then this second death might be an echo of the same old fear, that one day the truth about Margaret Arkwright would be laid bare for all to see. Before the constable could draw any firm conclusions, a local handyman stepped forward to make a startling confession. He claimed he had been in the midst of a drunken argument with Mrs. Pettigrew by the pond, and that in his anger he had pushed her. Weeping and trembling, he insisted that her death was an accident, that he had panicked and fled. Many in the village clung to this explanation with a kind of desperate relief. It offered a tidy resolution, freeing them from the darker suspicions that had begun to swirl. Yet Miss Marple noted how the handyman's story contained peculiar inconsistencies. He stammered over key details. Where exactly had he met Mrs. Pettigrew, and why? His eyes darted nervously each time he tried to elaborate. Miss Marple could not help but recall the footprints at the water's edge. They might easily fit a larger frame like that of the handyman, but something in her intuition whispered that this confession was too neat, too swift. If he had truly argued with Mrs. Pettigrew, would the outcome align so perfectly with certain other, more carefully hidden agendas. In the days that followed, Miss Marple watched the handyman's every gesture, the tension in his posture, the way he avoided meeting certain individuals' eyes. She suspected he was acting under a sense of obligation or fear, as though covering for someone else, someone who perhaps carried far greater authority in his life than a mere client. Quietly, Miss Marple gathered small observations. A hasty whisper outside the post office, a curious exchange of money witnessed at the back of the grocer's. With each passing day, her conviction grew that this supposed drunken quarrel was a fabrication meant to placate the authorities. The question, of course, was who could wield such influence over the handyman that he would risk a false confession to protect them. Miss Marple considered the circle of older women connected to Margaret Arkwright's story, women whose secrets ran deep. Could one of them have orchestrated this ruse, ensuring suspicion fell on the most convenient scapegoat? Satisfied that the puzzle was more intricate than it first appeared, Miss Marple resolved to probe further. The truth, she reminded herself, often lay hidden in plain sight, just waiting for the right thread to be pulled. Miss Marple believed firmly that the simplest errands often yielded the richest information. Thus, she made a point of visiting the local grocer under the guise of restocking her larder, all the while keeping her ears open for the trivial remarks and stray comments that inevitably floated amid the produce and tinned goods. The grocer, a man with a friendly smile and an uncanny memory, took great pride in knowing a bit about everyone. He spoke in low tones about the older generation of the village, recalling when Margaret Arkwright had first appeared at the sewing circle with her bright eyes and laughter. He chuckled at how many hearts she'd turned, sometimes without even trying. Then, as if recalling a small scandal, he mentioned a particular quarrel, a broken engagement that had once caused quite a stir. Although the details were vague, he leaned forward and lowered his voice, suggesting that Margaret's short-lived betrothal had been the catalyst for more than one whispered argument in those days. Miss Marple listened politely, offering only the occasional nod or exclamation of surprise. She knew better than to press too hard. The grocer relished unfolding his tales at his own pace. As she completed her purchase, she was left with the sense that Margaret's romances were a thread woven deeply into the tapestry of the sewing circle, a thread that might yet unravel the secrets behind the recent tragedies. The next opportunity for discreet inquiry presented itself at the church fete, where Miss Marple, ever dutiful, volunteered to assist at the jam stall. Between selling jars of strawberry preserve and handing out small samples, she observed the social currents swirling about her. Villagers drifted by, pausing to comment on the weather or make polite chatter, but Miss Marple's quick ears caught a sudden slip of the tongue from two women gossiping over scones. They spoke in hushed tones about how Margaret had been more than merely a rival to Mrs. Hargreaves. It seemed Margaret had known something, a piece of leverage that gave her the upper hand when it came to ensuring Mr. Hargreaves's affections. One of the women hinted at a letter, or perhaps a secret note, that Margaret had threatened to reveal. Startled by her own indiscretion, she quickly changed the subject when she noticed Miss Marple's gentle gaze. Miss Marple made no outward sign of alarm, merely offering a pleasant smile and a remark on the excellent jam. Inwardly, however, her thoughts whirled. If Margaret had truly possessed damaging information about Mrs. Hargreaves, it could explain a great deal. The question remained, how far would someone go to keep that knowledge hidden? It was a discreet conversation with an older villager that confirmed the grocer's earlier insinuations. The villager, shifting her weight uncomfortably as she spoke, admitted that Mr. Hargreaves had once been engaged to Margaret before he ever laid eyes on his eventual wife. This was something few spoke of openly, as the entire matter had been quietly brushed aside once Margaret disappeared. Miss Marple sensed that the woman felt a measure of relief in unburdening herself of such memories, though she stopped short of explaining precisely why Margaret and Mr. Hargreaves parted ways. The reasons, she implied, were too layered with shame and regret. When Miss Marple gently pressed for more, the villager only shook her head, muttering that some things were best left in the past. Yet the admission alone was enough to reshape Miss Marple's understanding of the Hargreaves household. Perhaps Mr. Hargreaves's marriage to Mrs. Hargreaves had never been free of doubt. And if so, Miss Marple wondered whether that lingering doubt had played a role in forging old resentments, or even stirring new ones. For a heart once divided between two women might harbor complications that time and discretion could not fully erase. In the course of her quiet fact-finding, Miss Marple encountered a retired maid who had once worked for the Hargreaves family. Over a cup of tea, the maid, hands trembling slightly, as she recalled those tumultuous days, disclosed that Mr. Hargreaves had continued to meet Margaret even after his wedding. These secret rendezvous, she claimed, went on until the very week Margaret vanished. Her eyes darted about as if fearing she might be overheard. Yet once she began talking, the words tumbled forth. She recalled noticing how Mr. Hargreaves would return from these encounters agitated, sometimes smelling faintly of perfume that was not his wife's. Although the maid had never witnessed any overt conflict, she sensed the undercurrents of desperation. Margaret, she suspected, had believed in a love that might eventually triumph, while Mr. Hargreaves struggled with guilt and loyalty. Miss Marple, ever composed, thanked the maid kindly and assured her of discretion. Yet the implications weighed on her mind. If this clandestine relationship had continued until Margaret's sudden disappearance, it raised troubling questions about just how far Mr. Hargreaves, or someone protective of him, would go to preserve a public facade and keep the past from intruding on the present. Now that Mrs. Hargreaves herself lay dead, Miss Marple saw the chilling pattern revealed with new clarity. If Margaret's departure had once solved a problem for those who feared scandal, her re-emergence through Mrs. Fanshaw's probing questions seemed to reignite old grudges. The two murders, first Mrs. Hargreaves, then Mrs. Pettigrew, took on a more sinister complexion. It was not just silence that someone sought, but the final erasure of guilt and unfinished business. Miss Marple reflected on the tangled relationships that bound the sewing circles past and present together, a romantic triangle complicated by secret trysts and possibly blackmail. Each revelation pointed to a powerful motive, one that had never truly disappeared. Instead, it festered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike again. As she walked home, Miss Marple pondered how many more lives might be at risk. She sensed that the killer, whoever it was, would stop at nothing to keep these lingering truths buried. And yet, in the quiet depths of her mind, Miss Marple believed that the final threads of this mystery were drawing taut. All that remained was to pull them together before another tragedy befell the village. Miss Marple had long known that the vicarage held more than just the everyday record of parish life. While assisting the vicar's wife with sorting old papers one quiet afternoon, she casually opened an aged drawer. Tucked away among neglected letters and forgotten memos was an unsent letter, its envelope slightly yellowed and marked with a date, the very night Margaret disappeared. Miss Marple's heart gave a small, measured flutter. Here was a tangible link to a mystery that had haunted the village for decades. She handled the letter with the utmost care, as if its contents might shatter the delicate balance of secrets the village had so carefully maintained. The letter, addressed to Margaret's sister, was written in a hurried yet deliberate hand. Every word hinted at a desperate urgency, and a plan that had been set into motion under the cover of darkness. Though the letter had never been sent, its existence spoke volumes. It was as if Margaret herself had tried to leave behind a final message, a plea for understanding or perhaps a warning. Miss Marple folded the letter neatly, her mind already whirring with possibilities. She knew that this small piece of paper could unlock many of the secrets that had been so artfully concealed over the years. With quiet determination, she resolved to examine its contents closely, certain that within its words lay the key to long-forgotten truths. Later that day, as Miss Marple sat in her study and carefully reread the letter, its true purpose began to emerge. The letter revealed that Margaret had once intended to elope with her lover, a bold and secretive plan, born of passion and defiance. Yet the words on the page carried an undercurrent of dread. Margaret had feared that someone within the intimate confines of the sewing circle might have discovered her intentions. There was a tremor in the lines where she mentioned her lover's name, and the promise of a new life far from the prying eyes of the village. The letter was addressed not to a prospective husband or a friend, but to Margaret's sister, as though she hoped the family would stand as witnesses to her escape. But the tone was conflicted. What began as a declaration of love transformed into a desperate confession of fear. It was clear that Margaret had been tormented by the idea that the secrets of her planned elopement might not remain hidden. This revelation stirred Miss Marple's thoughts. If Margaret had been prepared to forsake everything for love, then the subsequent events must have been set in motion by forces far more potent than mere youthful indiscretion. The plan to elope, intended to liberate Margaret, instead laid the groundwork for a tragedy that still resonated in hushed conversations decades later. As Miss Marple pondered the implications of Margaret's plan, a further deduction took shape. The letter, unsent and now in her careful possession, hinted at a fateful encounter on that very night. It seemed likely that someone had intercepted Margaret's escape, a visitor in the dark whose intervention had derailed the elopement. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, piecing together the scant clues from the letter with what she had heard in passing over the years. The timing was suggestive. The letter's date, matching the night of the planned elopement, confirmed that events had taken a drastic turn then. Who might have wished to prevent such an escape? And why would they go to such lengths? The possibilities raced through Miss Marple's thoughts, each more unsettling than the last. Was this visitor driven by a personal vendetta, a desire to protect family honor, or something far more sinister? Her intuition told her that the same individual who had stopped Margaret from eloping might now be responsible for the deadly acts that had unsettled the village. The careful, calculated intervention of this mysterious visitor was not an act of chance. It was deliberate. Miss Marple resolved that this connection between past and present was no coincidence, but a thread to be pulled until the entire tapestry of deceit unraveled. That very evening, as Miss Marple reflected on the implications of the intercepted elopement, word reached her of a new act of violence. In the quiet of her own thoughts, she learned that Mrs. Fanshawe had been struck from behind in her cottage. The assault was swift and unprovoked, a violent interruption meant to silence any further inquiry into Margaret's long-hidden secrets. Miss Marple's heart sank as she heard the news. It was clear to her that the attack was no random act of vandalism or a spur-of-the-moment act of anger. Rather, it was the calculated move of someone determined to ensure that Margaret's past, and by extension the dangerous revelations it might bring, remained forever concealed. The timing of the attack, coinciding with the recent resurfacing of the unsent letter, could not be ignored. In the aftermath, Mrs. Fanshawe, though injured, managed to murmur that she had received a warning, A final, desperate message that someone was willing to resort to violence to protect their secrets. Miss Marple, with her trademark calm, took note of every detail. She understood that the attack was not only a physical assault, but also a clear signal. The forces aligned against the truth were still at work, and they would stop at nothing to keep the past buried. In the quiet that followed the tumult of the day, Miss Marple found herself tending to Mrs. Fanshaw's injuries with careful, measured words. Though the cottage was filled with anxious whispers about the attack, Miss Marple's focus remained on the deeper currents of guilt and fear that had long pervaded the sewing circle. In private, as she wrapped a bandage around a trembling hand, she mused over the evidence that had steadily accumulated. The unsent letter, the thwarted elopement, the violent assault. It all pointed to one unmistakable conclusion. The killer, whose shadow had loomed over both past and present, must be one of the original sewing circle members. Someone driven by an inescapable mix of fear and guilt, determined to ensure that the scandal of Margaret's vanished future, and all its implications, never saw the light of day. With a quiet resolve, Miss Marple vowed to follow this thread. She knew that the truth, buried deep under layers of old resentments and unspoken betrayals, would ultimately emerge. And when it did, the legacy of the sewing circle would be irrevocably changed. Miss Marple had arranged a meeting at the vicarage under the pretext of seeking assistance with a village charity. As the surviving members of the sewing circle assembled, a weighty tension permeated the air. Their greetings were courteous but edged with an unspoken apprehension. In measured tones they exchanged pleasantries, yet each word carried a trace of reluctance, as if they all knew this gathering was a means to an end rather than a simple social call. Miss Marple's calm demeanor, laced with quiet determination, invited confidences. Even as the conversation drifted toward mundane matters, every woman seemed to be guarding a secret. In that charged silence, subtle glances and brief pauses spoke volumes. The vicarage, known for its understated hospitality, now served as the arena where long-buried truths were about to be unearthed. Miss Marple's voice, gentle and precise, set the tone for the meeting. A tone that promised to reveal the tangled web of past betrayals and unspoken guilt. With the group assembled, Miss Marple began her inquiries with unassuming delicacy. She engaged each woman in casual conversation, gently nudging them to recall fragments of the past. "Perhaps you might share what you remember about that fateful evening," she would ask, her tone warm yet probing. One by one, the women offered hesitant recollections, snatches of conversation, half-forgotten disputes, and moments of inexplicable tension. Their responses, laced with inconsistencies and soft denials, revealed more than they intended. Miss Marple's quiet observations picked up on every pause and every faltering word. In the interplay of gentle questions and measured answers, a pattern began to emerge. A tapestry of forgotten loyalties and buried resentments. The subtle interplay of truth and omission hinted that the truth was concealed beneath layers of polite deflection and shared complicity. Each carefully chosen question served as a thread, drawing out the hidden details that had long been shrouded in silence. As the conversation deepened, Miss Marple began piecing together accounts of that long-ago night when Margaret had vanished. Whispers emerged suggesting that Mrs. Hargreaves, overwhelmed by a surge of jealous fury, had confronted Margaret with a force that ended in a fatal push. One woman recalled in a trembling voice, "It was as if Mrs. Hargreaves lost all control, her anger boiling over into something dreadful." The narrative, though fragmented, painted a picture of a collision between fierce passion and bitter rivalry. Miss Marple listened intently, discerning how each woman's account subtly shifted the focus, never directly accusing, yet hinting that jealousy had transformed into something irrevocable. It was as if the very air in the room grew heavy with the weight of unspoken blame. The quiet but steady revelations suggested that the moment of confrontation was not a spontaneous lapse, but the tragic culmination of long-held resentments. The fatal jealousy, it appeared, had been the spark that ignited a chain of events, intertwining old grievances with the present mystery. As the testimonies unfolded, a disturbing consensus became apparent. A pact of silence had been forged among the women of the sewing circle. In hushed tones, several admitted that after Margaret's untimely disappearance, an unspoken agreement was reached, never to speak of what truly occurred that night. "We must let it remain in the past," one of them murmured, a statement that resonated with the quiet fear of long-held secrets. This collective silence, born of both shame and a desperate desire to protect their reputations, bound them together in complicity. Miss Marple noted how each refusal to revisit those memories reinforced the notion that the truth was too dangerous to confront openly. The pact, though never formally acknowledged, had been the silent guardian of a dark secret, one that had festered over the years, its weight growing heavier with every unspoken word. In the measured cadence of their replies, Miss Marple sensed that the cost of breaking that pact might be far greater than any one of them was willing to bear. Yet it was precisely that secret which now threatened to unravel the fabric of their carefully maintained lives. In a quiet, tremulous confession, it emerged that Mrs. Pettigrew had been on the brink of revealing a truth too painful for the circle to endure. Whispers suggested that her conscience, burdened by guilt and the relentless pressure of secrecy, had driven her to the point where she could no longer hold back. She was ready to speak, to admit what she knew. One voice confided softly, as though sharing a dangerous secret. Yet before she could voice her revelations, fate intervened. Miss Marple considered that the silence forced upon Mrs. Pettigrew might not have been accidental at all, but a deliberate act to prevent her confession. Her death, then, was not simply a tragic end but a calculated measure, one that ensured the secret remained intact, even as it cast a long, dark shadow over the entire circle. When all was said, and the truths had been painfully laid bare, the sewing circle, once a tight-knit, if troubled community, lay broken in a heavy, suffocating silence. The revelation of long-hidden betrayals and unspoken complicity shattered the fragile bonds that had held them together for decades. Each member sat in quiet resignation, burdened by the weight of their shared guilt. Miss Marple observed this quiet devastation, understanding that the unraveling of secrets had rendered the circle irrevocably fractured. In that somber moment, the legacy of their past misdeeds lay exposed, leaving only a shattered remnant of what once was a united front. With the formal case now closed, Miss Marple found herself compelled to pay one final, discreet visit to Mrs. Fanshawe. At the threshold of the modest cottage, she was met with a reserved greeting, the kind that carried both courtesy and a trace of wariness. Their conversation was measured, each word carefully chosen. Mrs. Fanshawe's tone was polite, yet beneath it lay an unmistakable tension, a guardedness that spoke of secrets too weighty to abandon. Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, inquired gently about recent events, her questions laced with subtle insistence. Though Mrs. Fanshawe answered with the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed her alibis, there was an undercurrent of something unspoken. The exchange was brief and deliberate, leaving no room for overt confrontation. Yet, in the cadence of their dialogue, Miss Marple discerned that the truth had long been in Mrs. Fanshaw's possession, long before she set foot back in the village. In the ensuing conversation, Miss Marple's gentle yet relentless questioning began to peel back the layers of deception. "You came here seeking answers, did you not?" she inquired softly, her tone both kind and unyielding. Mrs. Fanshawe hesitated, her replies measured. It became increasingly clear that her initial portrayal as a seeker of truth was merely a facade. With quiet precision, Miss Marple deduced that Mrs. Fanshawe had known the full truth about the old scandal long before her arrival. Her words, carefully chosen, betrayed her true intent: to use that knowledge for blackmail, rather than for any noble purpose. The revelation was not shouted, but emerged slowly, like the turning of a key in a long-locked door. In that delicate moment, the air between them grew thick with the weight of unspoken history. Mrs. Fanshaw's carefully maintained mask of concern began to slip, revealing a glimpse of the calculating mind beneath. Rather than exposing Mrs. Fanshaw's duplicity to the village, Miss Marple chose a course of quiet resolution. "It is best," she said in a measured tone, "that you leave St. Mary Mead. Let the past rest in peace, for its disturbance brings more sorrow than it is worth." Her words, though soft, carried an undeniable firmness, a gentle ultimatum that brooked no further discussion. Mrs. Fanshaw's response was subdued, a mix of regret and reluctant acceptance. Miss Marple's judgment was not harsh, but laced with the wisdom of one who had seen too many lives undone by secrets. In offering this quiet solution, Miss Marple ensured that the fragile calm of the village would be preserved, even if it meant allowing certain truth to remain unspoken. It was a resolution born of both compassion and pragmatism, a decision that balanced the need for justice with the preservation of peace. As Mrs. Fanshawe departed, Miss Marple lingered for a moment, contemplating the enduring influence of the sewing circle's secrets. In the measured cadence of her own thoughts, she reflected on how those hidden truths had shaped the lives and fates of so many. The legacy of the circle was not merely one of gossip and scandal. It was a tragic tapestry woven from love, betrayal, and quiet complicity. Each whispered conversation, every half-forgotten grievance, had contributed to a burden that weighed heavily on the hearts of the villagers. In that silent reflection, Miss Marple acknowledged that the legacy was as intricate as the delicate patterns of embroidery once created by the circle's members. It was a legacy that, despite the passage of time, continued to haunt the present, leaving its mark on every life touched by its darkness. On her way home that evening, Miss Marple encountered a subtle yet unmistakable sign that life in St. Mary Mead was ever in flux. A new resident had moved into the now empty cottage that had belonged to Mrs. Fanshawe. With a faint, knowing smile, Miss Marple mused quietly to herself. Every village begins its next story the moment the last one ends. The new arrival, whose presence hinted at fresh beginnings and undisclosed ambitions, served as a silent reminder that secrets, once unearthed, often give birth to new mysteries. In the quiet of her thoughts, Miss Marple recognized that, while the old chapters might close, the cycle of gossip, intrigue, and hidden truths would persist. Each new face carried the potential for a new secret, a new betrayal waiting in the wings. And so, with the gentle resolve of one who has seen the inexorable march of time, she walked on, ready to observe as the next chapter in St. Mary Mead's intricate story began to unfold. Thank you for joining me on this intricate journey through the shadows of St. Mary Mead. In our tale, Miss Marple's unerring wit peels back layers of long-held secrets within a quaint sewing circle, revealing how the past, filled with betrayal, jealousy, and silent compacts, continues to cast its long, inescapable shadow on the present. At its core, this mystery reminds us that secrets, no matter how deeply buried, always have a way of resurfacing, often with consequences as unpredictable as they are inevitable. The story's twists, unmasking hidden identities, tragic acts born of guilt, and the quiet re-emergence of unresolved histories invite us to ponder the true cost of silence and the delicate balance between preserving peace and seeking truth. But here's a thought to leave you with. What if the new arrival in that empty cottage wasn't merely a symbol of fresh beginnings, but the harbinger of yet another hidden secret waiting to unravel? What would you have done if you discovered that the past was not as dead as it seemed? I'd love to hear your theories and reflections on this mystery. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights and interpretations are what make these stories come alive. If you enjoyed this journey into the heart of hidden truths, don't forget to subscribe for more captivating mysteries and share this video with friends and family who appreciate a good twist. Thank you for watching. And remember, in every quiet village there's a story waiting to be told.